Welcome. My name is Matt Roy. I think I know most of you in the room. I'm the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Civic Engagement here at UMass Dartmouth. I'm going to usher you through the afternoon. And at different points in time, I may need to bully the presenters to stay on time. So I'm asking for your forgiveness for my bullying up front. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our Chancellor, Dr. Robert Johnson, who's going to welcome the crowd. Briefly about Dr. Johnson. I think he's been here nearly 9 months now, and it has absolutely been transformational for our organization, both in terms of policies and procedures and also in terms of cultural change. And the main focus and the main cultural change is that we are coming to an understanding as faculty and as students that our education is not for ourselves alone, that it's not a degree to hang up on the wall, but it's actually something that we can use to be change agents in this global community. So please join me in the game changer for UMass Dartmouth, in welcoming the game changer for UMass Dartmouth, Dr. Robert Johnson.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Dr. Matt Roy for bringing and pulling all of you together and all of the great work he does with civic engagement. He has truly been a light, a candle in the dark, if you will, for this institution and all that we do, and all of the work that we get done with the Ledoux Center. Let's give Dr. Roy a big hand. And I also want to welcome one of my colleagues and partners in crime, the president of Bristol Community College, Dr. Laura Douglas. Laura. And I want to thank Dr. Nicholas Longo who will be our keynote speaker, who you will hear from here shortly. He's over at Providence College. You know, they have this little thing, basketball or something. But welcome and thank you for being here. You know, I'm really excited about this event and the things that we're going to be doing, because when we think about civic engagement, we're committed to civic engagement here at UMass Dartmouth. The graduating class of 2017, 82% of our students participated in at least one service learning project, at least one. You know, on a planet with more than 7 billion people, as an educated person, we represent the top 1% on the planet. And the fact that we put things in place that will literally help our students to be civically engaged and understand what their social responsibility is to go out into the world and make a difference, I think is really, really, really important. So the fact that all of you all are here today, all of you are here to try and help us and others have a conversation and a dialogue about what it means to be an engaged and educated citizen is really, really, really important. Think about this. We're educating a generation of young people for jobs that do not yet exist, to solve problems that have not been identified, utilizing technologies yet to be created. 65% of the jobs of the future that will be available for our kids who are in grade school and middle school don't even exist, nor do they have a name. Over 40% of the jobs that exist today will be done by robots. So we're educating a generation of young people who will not go out and get the next job, but that will go out and create the next job. And part of that is via civic engagement. Part of that is about making a difference in the lives and of the people whom we touch and we see each and every day. So on behalf of the entire campus community, on behalf of UMass Dartmouth, sitting here on 710 acres of land, we provide a private college educational experience and a public university value, 15 minutes from the ocean and a half an hour from the Cape. That's who we are. I thank you for being here. I want you to enjoy your day. You will see me sneak out at some point simply because I got like 5 things I have to be doing at the same time, even like right now. So, but thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I am very grateful for the acknowledgement of my activities, but I really need to acknowledge the staff of the Ledoux Center. which guides students and faculty every single day. They are very dedicated to making partnerships with the community that are very fruitful in terms of maximizing the active learning opportunities of our students. So would you, in probably 10 seconds, give a round of applause to Gary Martin, Deirdre Healy, and Katie Doan. Okay, moving forward with our program, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Barbara Canis, who's the director of Massachusetts Campus Compact, who is co-promoting this activity with us. And I know Barbara's going to say I have a new title now that it's Southern New England Campus Compact or whatever it is, but she wouldn't let me sneak by with the old title. Anyway, and she's going to introduce our keynote, Nic Longo. So Barbara Canis.
Thank you. And my heart's in Massachusetts, even though I do have a new title of Membership Director of Southern New England Campus Compact. I want to thank everyone for being here, and we're thrilled to be co-sponsors of this event. And I'm not going to take up too many seconds, because Matt has reminded me several times, but I do want to just draw your attention to our calendar that's on one of your flyers in front of you, particularly the back page. That's really where you see the spring events for all members, all community partners, all students. Email me if you don't feel that you're invited and want to know why not, because you're welcome. And I want to particularly draw your attention to the last 3 to 4 events that are happening in the spring. We just sent out an invitation about our Food Insecurity Summit that's happening May 11th at Worcester State University. And this has been an issue that I know is on the top of many community colleges, four-year colleges, Research One. It's an issue that we all need to address, and it relates to what I believe Nic will probably talk about today, and that's how we need to get our students involved in these issues. They want to be involved in these issues, and they want to be public problem solvers, and that's what Campus Compact is all about. So thank you. I now have the privilege of introducing a friend and a colleague. He's from, and I'm going to read the few notes of his title so I don't get it wrong. But I just consider him a friend, and he's been with me. I was thinking about it. We've been together for 20 years, but he looks young and I look old, so I don't know how that happens. But Nic is Chair of Public and Community Service Studies and Professor of Global Studies at Providence College, and he's also the author of a number of books, articles, and reports on youth civic engagement, community-based learning, global citizenship, and service learning. So here's Nic.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for that introduction, and thank you to President Johnson and Matt Roy. I've been a fan of the Center for Civic Engagement here for many years and really impressed with the work that you're doing, especially around faculty support and the work around service learning. So it's great to be here in person. Let me start by saying I'm a little nervous because I have 2 of my mentors in the room, and so John Saltmarsh was my boss at Campus Compact and has been an important guiding post for the work that I'm doing. And Claire Street, who is a former student of mine, who's a next generation leader now at Harvard, are in the room. So let me say, when I start, any good ideas I have tonight is probably got from one of those 2 folks, and the rest are from me. Let me say that where I'm at in my work and what I've been thinking a lot about is a crisis of democracy. And this isn't a crisis that I think started at the last election. It's a crisis that goes back before that. And it's a crisis that I think that higher education has a role in. And it's also a crisis that I think higher education isn't doing enough to address. So what I want to talk about today is that I think the Next Generation Engagement Project needs to be connected to democratic renewal. And when I talk about the crisis of democracy, what I'm thinking about comes out of a tradition of the Highlander Folk School. So the Highlander Folk School was an educational center in the labor movement and the civil rights movement. And Miles Horton, the founder, talked about this idea of democracy. And democracy being if you have a group of folks sitting around a country store and they have a problem that needs to be solved, they could do one of two things. They could either figure out how to solve it themselves and work with the resources they can have, or they can go out and they can ask an expert, someone outside the community, to come solve it for them. If they try to solve it themselves and work through their assets, that's democracy. I've been thinking about these kinds of questions really without even knowing it since I was a young boy. I grew up in a political family. When I went to college, I was studying politics. And this was the mid-1990s. And our political system in our country, I think, was in crisis. We had sex scandals, we had impeachment, we had a really polarized society. It sounds very different from our contemporary political culture. But I think it was actually the start of the political culture that we're seeing today. And really, without even knowing it, I got into 3 different service learning courses that semester. And what that did was that changed my life. And it changed my life for a couple of reasons. One thing was I began to see that I didn't have to choose between my identity as a student and my identity as someone who wanted to change the world. Service learning allowed me to connect those 2 things. But it also gave me a different way to understand politics. So politics wasn't what was going on in Washington, D.C. at the time. Politics was the community work that I was doing across differences in diverse settings, and I began to see this work as a citizen politics. A second really important transformation for me was when I worked with Barbara and John on a campaign called Raise Your Voice. And we were working with college students all around the country. And when I went and I talked to college students in the early 2000s about how they understood democracy, civic engagement, service, the one thing that came across was they didn't see politics as something they were learning or what people talked about in the classroom. What they saw was, and they learned about politics and democracy by the way it was practiced. So more and more I began to think about, we have to think about practices that are going to be consistent with the kinds of democratic engagement that we want to see with students. And we began calling that work deliberative pedagogy. And a last kind of really important touchstone for me was working on this next generation engagement project. And I've been committed to civic engagement work for the last 20 years since I was an undergraduate college student. But what I've begun to see with next generation engagement is the importance of institutional change. And really thinking about how we transform our institutions has to be a center and a vocal piece of our next generation engagement project. So as I started with some of my story, this movement in civic engagement has also traveled a great distance. And the term service learning was coined in 1967. And I know we have Dwight Giles in the room, who's been one of the real pioneers in service learning. And he's going to come after this and correct me on how I talk about the history, which he does every time I talk about. But let me, just a few important pieces of this. In the 1980s was when a lot of the institutional infrastructure for service began to be built in the founding of Campus Compact and Campus Outreach Opportunity League. And then we saw into the 1990s the movement towards service learning. And how do we build this work into the curriculum? And Dwight was a huge part of that work. One of the things I think is really important, which we began, I think it's from the beginning, but we saw in 1994 with the founding of the Invisible College, is that you begin to see different strands of how this work should be actualized on college campuses. So you see something like the Invisible College, a group of faculty saying, what we should be doing is cutting edge work on the margins. And even the name Invisible College represents that idea. Then there are other faculty who began to say, and practitioners, and say, no, we need to be legitimized by the academy. We need to do work that's going to be recognized and being taken seriously. And then I think a third strand is about transforming the academy. And I think throughout the engagement history, you see those 3 strands, and then some of the tensions between them throughout. Into the 2000s, you begin to see the work being more about the engaged campus and how you can think about this work beyond just the classroom and really think about the whole institution as a place that can be engaged with community transformation. A couple of important pieces were in 2008, Imagining America they did a publication and really thinking about how do we transform the tenure and promotion guidelines for campuses and begin to recognize this work. And then John Saltmarsh had a book with Matt Hartley, where he began to think about to serve a larger purpose, and how does our work in higher education, it felt at that time like it was stuck, and we need to begin to reimagine what it might be. So let me say, so my daughter just went to this escape room. Have folks been to an escape room? So you know what those are? And so riddles are a big part of our family right now, where we kind of have fun with them. So I've got a riddle for you that's connected to this. So how can you travel a great distance without getting anywhere? Do you have any?
Within introspection.
Introspection, okay. Any others? Yeah. Talking to people, okay, that kind of fits. Yes, Suzanne, going in a circle. So traveling in a circle. So that's a part of what our work is, this traveling in a circle is, right now I think higher education is at a crossroads. Every one of our campuses is dealing with this tension between kind of whatever you want to call it, a neoliberal, market-driven set of ideas and values, and the need for our campuses to be more publicly engaged. And then we have reports like the Crucible Moment, who are saying that the undisputed educational priority needs to be democratic engagement. And at the same time, someone like Ira Harkavy at the University of Pennsylvania saying, you know, if our universities are so great, why does our society have so many problems? So that gets at some of the crisis of democracy I started with. This comes out of the Kettering Foundation research. I think there's three kind of meta-narratives of why we're in crisis. One is just a loss of trust in institutions. And you see this across any kind of data sets around how we trust in institutions, from the press to including higher education more and more, especially around some of the polarization lines. A second piece is the civic empowerment gap, where citizens and the folks that need to be really at the center of solving problems are too often at the sidelines. And then a third piece is that we have these adaptive challenges. And adapted wicked problems are different from technical problems, because these are challenges like climate change, like inequality, like race relations, that can't be solved by technical expertise. So if we think that higher education has a role in these issues, you know, why is this problem of going in a circle? Why aren't we really making some progress? And I think part of it comes out of this quote from Harry Boyd in some of his work, where he talks about that higher education in a larger democracy is inexplicably tied to the way those of us in higher education understand citizenship and democracy. So it's not only that we are engaged with these questions, but how we're putting these ideas into practice. And he talks about the need for us to be builders of democracy, not simply helpers, voters, analysts, informers, or critics of democracy. This work also builds on some of the work that Matt Hartley and John Saltmarsh have done around different frameworks for engagement. And they make this tension between democratic versus technocratic. So technocratic reflects the dominant academic culture, characterized as rationalized, objectified, or technocratic, versus publicly engaged, which reflects a culture that values different ways of knowing and begins to have questions like, how can we solve these problems together? Here's a chart that they put together to differentiate some of these things. So you begin to think about things, instead of solving problems for communities, to do work with communities, instead of a deficit-based model, an asset-based model. So within this kind of framework and this understanding, since 2009, there's been a group of us that have been working on this book project, and Matt's a great publicist for our project. And with Margaret Post and Elaine Ward and John Saltmarsh, Tim Eatman, there's been a group of us who've been thinking about what does the next generation of engagement look like. And part of our findings are that some of what's emerging in next generation engagement is different from in earlier generations. So here's a couple of our findings. First, there's a cadre of scholar practitioners who span the boundaries between the academy and the community. This probably won't be a surprise to anyone in this room. Many of these new generations did service learning and community engagement scholarship as undergraduate and graduate students. So that's a foundation for their experiences now, very much like my experience as a student. There's a growing representation from those who have been historically underrepresented, so especially women, people of color, first-generation individuals, whose identities are directly tied to community engagement. These diverse group of practitioners recognize and value different ways of knowing. So there's a shift in a way of knowing of where knowledge gets created. And it doesn't get created within the boundaries of a university. It gets created in co-creation with our partners. And finally, there's these emerging scholars navigate the existing systems, and as they go through the academy, begin to mentor this next generation, creating communities of practice, very much like your faculty scholars that you have here on campus. So some of the norms that are emerging. One is a participatory epistemology. So the way knowledge gets created is through a participatory process. We're seeing more and more collaborative teaching and learning strategies. Scholarly artifacts as publications. So what are the different ways we can acknowledge and recognize artifacts of scholarship beyond just peer-reviewed publications? Non-academic knowledge experts, and seeing that as part of our peer network, including doing some reviews of tenure and promotion processes. A movement even beyond interdisciplinary work to transdisciplinary work, where it's about different disciplines coming together to solve problems collectively. And then the last piece is to really rethink what the tenure track clock looks like why this arbitrary idea of a 6-year tenure clock. A big piece of this project has been collecting narratives and hearing people's stories, and that's an important part of this shift in epistemology and the way we know, is recognizing the importance of these stories. So we've collected a lot of narratives from next generation scholars. And one of the things that we're hearing is a shift from an early path to this new trajectory. And Dwight gives me a hard time when I talk about this. So there is a pioneering group of folks who did service learning who I think have a unique set of pathways. But folks who were doing the early work in service learning, their path tended to be around getting through the kind of traditional tenure track process, but then becoming disillusioned after tenure, and then shifting to service learning, community engagement, as a way to get back to why they really began their work. What we're seeing now is folks that are coming into this work are committed to doing civic engagement, community engagement from the beginning, and it's because it's part of who they are. It's part of their identity. And here's a great example of that. And this is, I've got a few narratives to talk about. So the first is, so John Wallace was founder of the Invisible College. He's actually on my dissertation committee, and he talks about his career trajectory. And his career trajectory was very much like a lot of folks in his generation, where he came to the University of Minnesota as a tenured, he was a full professor, he was a star in his field. And he became disillusioned, and he found this was meaningless. And he didn't want to do this kind of work anymore, where he was just writing to a really small, narrow audience of folks in his field, which was the philosophy of language. So he had to either leave the academy or change what he did. And what he did was he changed the way he saw his teaching and his engagement work. And he said, this is a system that treats people badly. So I had to get out or radically change what I did. Then if you compare that to someone like Taniya Mitchell. So Taniya Mitchell is one of the real leading scholars now in service learning, civic engagement, has done a lot of work on critical service learning and diversity and engagement. She's also at the University of Minnesota about 35 years later. Her path is very different. You know, she started doing this work as an undergraduate student when she got involved in service learning courses. She did her doctoral dissertation at UMass Amherst on the Citizen Scholar Program. She moved around to different positions, looking for where she could best contribute. And this is the way she talks about it. She talks about it that she blurs the line between campus and community in an effort to find my place. And she trusts that the commitment to public engagement listed in my job description and the university website will be put into practice. I put these two side by side because they're at the same institution, 40 years apart, and there really haven't been radically changes in the way we understand the scholarship expectations, but we need to do that if we're going to support the next generation. So next set of narrative is Lena Zastillo, who's one of the leaders in doing work around really practitioners and civic practitioners on campus, and she talks about this tension between marginalization and change, where it remains a struggle for her as she feels her presence and values is questioned on campus, and she still feels like she lacks the power and influence to on campus. But at the same time, what she said, because of this feeling, she said, the structural and cultural resistance I described leads me to adapt informal and relational strategies to organize institutional change. So part of this marginalization on campus is a changing in identity and a strategy around how you work with others on campus. As a second narrative that emerged is around boundary spanning. And this is Emily Yankee at UNC Greensboro. And she says, I'm a boundary spanner. It defines how I find myself and what I do. It means I live within the worlds that are seemingly distinct, and sometimes it feels as though I exist in that space in between them. And so she is constantly spanning boundaries as a civic engagement practitioner between the universities, different practitioners, and external boundaries on campus. So boundary spanning is a key practice for this next generation engagement. And the last piece is this idea of paving new professional pathways. And this is Patrick Green, who's at Loyola University of Chicago. And he talks about his identity as a community-engaged scholar practitioner and having multiple dimensions to his work. And different folks see him in different capacities. But what he says is, as these labels are true, there's no established or widely accepted descriptor. What he needs to begin to do is pave a new professional pathway for his work. And I think that's very much the spirit of what we're doing here today. So some of the themes that have emerged from this next generation engagement project is one is the importance of boundary spanning and fracturing identity. The real need to secure legitimacy and the widening of legitimacy of expertise and what that means on our campuses. And then this tension point, and I think this is a tension from the beginning of the tension between not wanting our work to be marginalized, but also not wanting to be co-opted on campuses. And a key practice that has emerged is important of mentoring and building communities of practice. I mean, it's probably the simplest lesson we can learn, but it's come across as really central. So we're going to have this amazing group of panelists today and to really highlight some of the work that's happening here at UMass Dartmouth. And I think part of the way to frame this and understand it is this idea of what are the next generation collaboratories? What are the spaces we need to create to do transformative work? And we're going to get a chance to hear more of that. One place that I just visited, I was just at Miami University of Hamilton. And like here at UMass, they have a faculty fellows program. But this is the first time I've seen a fellows program where they had 8 faculty and 8 community partners together. And they made a year-long commitment to work collaboratively, identify projects, be there side by side, which is a really hard thing to do because so many of our conversations are about the community, but the community folks aren't at the table with us side by side as we're working, developing, and creating projects together. So I think that's an important project to highlight, and then to think about what are the other next generation collaboratories we need to think through and create. So I'm going to end with this, with a story that for me has epitomized some of this work, and it's a story I heard. It's called The Story of African Genius, and I heard it when I was in actually North Africa in Egypt. And heard the story as, so there's this man, and he wants to capture all the wisdom in the world. And so he gets this big bag, and he goes around and has all these sets of experiences and captures this wisdom and puts it in his bag and carries this bag. And then he wants to put the bag in a safe space, so he puts it up, carries it up, and puts it in this majestic tree. He goes down, has more experiences, captures these lessons, puts them up and gets them, carries them up to this tree. At some point, there's just too much in the bag, and he gets stuck, and he can't get the rest of his wisdom up in this tree. So he calls down, and he says to his son, and he says, "Son, can you help me get this wisdom up in this tree?" And the son says back to him, he says, "Father, if you had all the wisdom in that bag, you'd know that that wasn't meant to be up in a tree. It's meant to be as part of the world." And I end with that story and really like it because I think it's a powerful narrative for what we're doing today. In one sense, I think this father was on the right track, that wisdom comes from experience, right? It's experiential, community-based learning. But he had this fatal flaws of thinking that it wasn't meant to be public. It wasn't collaborative. It wasn't participatory. But the real reason I love that story. And then the person who told it to me, I actually went and asked them afterwards. I was like, this is very different. Because usually when these kinds of parables are told, it's the elder who has the wisdom and is passing it down to the next generation. In this case, it's reversed. And it's this next generation, the son, who has the kind of the tagline of the parable. And I think that's important. So as we're thinking about what next generation engagement is, let's look at our undergraduate students. Let's look at our early career faculty. Let's look at graduate students. Let's look at young people in our community. And we see that with the activism going on right now and with Parkland. Is that where we can get the energy and the ideas for next generation engagement to transform higher education and our democracy? So thanks for having me help kick this off, and I'm excited to be here.
Don't go anywhere, Nick. You stay up there. I'm going to run around with the microphone. We have about 5 or 10 minutes for questions for Nick. Now's not the time to be shy. What Nick did not share is that he's also an expert on dialogue, so he'd be disappointed if we don't dialogue with him. Claire, you know I'm going to call on you if we don't get a question soon. All right, Dwight. Dwight, let me give you the mic.
First of all, Nick, perfect. No corrections to date. What's your next project going to be?
That's a good question. So the thing I'm working on now. So I guess one of the things I'm really passionate about is around transforming teaching and learning and having that space. So there's a group of us who've just finished this book project on deliberative pedagogy. And the one thing that I've noticed more and more as I am kind of in this world of folks that are doing dialogue and deliberation on campus and folks who are doing service learning, community engagement on campus is that they're often separate worlds. So I'm really interested in thinking through how we bring some of these best practices around engaged learning together, and so that we can begin to learn from each other and collaborate. So very on a specific level, how do we take the work around dialogue and deliberation and build that into our reflective practices for service learning? But then at the same time, dialogue and deliberation can often just be talk and very esoteric. So how can then we take the activism component of community engagement and connect that to the dialogue world? So I guess my next project is really trying to bring those worlds together.
So I have a comment and a question. First, the comment. It strikes me that your definition of democracy is rooted in John McKnight's work around asset-based community development and things of that nature. And then my question about universities becoming more democratic, and what in particular have you seen in terms of cutting-edge university practice and change around tenure and promotion policies?
Around tenure, well, I mean, at our institute, so we have a Department of Public and Community Service Studies and a Department of Global Studies that I'm in both of them. And we've used some of the work from Imagining America and the Tenure Team Initiative to write our tenure and promotion guidelines. So it's just an expectation, and it's recognized to do engaged scholarship, but also engaged pedagogy is just a part of the expectations of the work that we're doing at Providence College. I think there's other folks in the room who've done a lot more work around, so I'd love to hear what other folks have seen as good examples of what this could look like at other institutions.
John, do you know?
Oh, no.
All right, other questions for Nick? Yeah, Chad, hold on.
So Nick, just to follow up on that, at Providence College, you have departmental standards that you've established to help incentivize faculty, or at least recognize the value of civic engagement and the kind of scholarship that might be transboundary. Yep. How has that flowed up in your experience, right? So I get it at the department level. How has that flowed up through the college, which it might work in that college? We don't have a school or college that's similar. But at the highest administrative levels, has there been a deep understanding of what that means and an acceptance of that
right?
The reason why is because I think that's fundamental to incentivizing, right? A transition at the institution so that people feel more empowered, scholars feel more empowered to do exactly what you said, both undergraduate, graduate, et cetera.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And I think that's, especially when we hire junior faculty, that's one of the concerns, is saying like, this is what it says on paper, but as like Tim Eatman from Imagining America says, policies don't vote. So how do you make sure that it's part of the culture of the institution? I mean, some of the things that we've done is just be really strategic around our faculty committee. Our campuses are like the Committee on Academic Rank and Tenure. So I've done presentations for that committee around engaged scholarship. They had to approve our guidelines so they understand what they were, and I also met with them when they were approving the guidelines. We've got our provosts to come to sessions on engaged scholarship that we've put on campus. So that's some of the kind of strategic work that I think has to be done, because I think just having something like that on paper alone isn't enough.
Have you hit roadblocks? Do you have any examples of,
We haven't necessarily hit, we've had some successful cases. We did have one of our, like we've got junior faculty who also feel like this might be recognized at Providence College, but what if I want to go to another institution, right? Am I going to then be saying like only Providence College will recognize our work? So that's why this has to be part of a larger institutional change, and you can't just have islands of one institution doing this kind of work. So I think that's a real tension, because there's a broader culture across higher education that you can't always control.
Okay, let's give Nic a hand. And ask Mark Page to segue up. So Mark is an associate professor of public policy here at UMass Dartmouth, and primarily focuses on education policy. And his presentation is entitled Building a Better Teacher, Understanding Value-Added Models in the Law of Teacher Evaluations. Mark Page.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Matt. Just in reflection on what Nic was saying, I want to publicly, this project is based off a book that I had published a little while ago, but in reflecting on doing the presentation here, I want to publicly thank my department because of the collegial atmosphere that I think is part of allowing me, and that's not just me, but the atmosphere is such that I have the freedom to work and think with, as reduced amount of chaos and so on that you could have. So I want to publicly thank the Department of Public Policy for the collegiality. Aside from that, one of the things prior to becoming a professor, I was a school law attorney and represented school districts. And frequently I would get clients who would say to me, look, we've got a lousy teacher here, and I'd like to terminate them. And so we'd look at the file, and it would be incredibly thin. And my answer was, well, you won't, at least because we're going to have a lot of legal problems here. There's no documentation, or the evaluations are kind of fluffy. Around the same time, these things called value-added models existed in other contexts, but were becoming popular in education. Value-added models are statistical models that are intended to estimate the effect of a teacher on a student's achievement, particularly in standardized tests. And they were advertised as kind of a silver bullet. We can connect all the dots, and we can make this termination. One of the advertised principles was that we could terminate the lousy teachers, and this would be pretty much the silver bullet, if you will, to kind of seal the deal. There was an awful lot of research around the issues of what was a good model. All these variables and these things, and so the research had debated a lot, and that's kind of where most of that had sat, but there was almost nothing about, well, when we put this on the ground, how is this going to be tested in high-stakes decisions that have legal implications, like firing someone, unions, and collective bargaining. So part of that is what drove this project, which was analysis of court decisions where value-added models were attempted to be used as justification for terminating poor teachers. So part of this is looking at them. What I found was that, in fact, they're having a paradoxical effect of actually creating more problems for school districts because of the hot debate about the validity of these statistical models and whether or not they can actually demonstrate some sort of relationship between the teacher impact on a student test. So as these proceeded up to the court level and litigation level, it actually became more complicated for school districts to fire poor performing teachers. These having to do with performance issues, not so much as immoral conduct, and that's kind of a separate issue. More to the point, when I went back also and looked at cases that sort of predated VAMs, it was apparent to me that courts will generally justify a termination based on the subjective opinion of a manager. They, in the words of a Supreme Court decision, we don't want to be super school boards, human resource kind of managers. So in fact, what's really required or to sort of sustain a termination based on performance is solid, subjective, but based on some professional judgment of school administrators and principals. So it's sort of flipped VAMs a little bit on their heads, although VAMs had this appeal, this kind of shiny object appeal. Of course, education policy and litigation in the courts is not a new thing. This is a forum where people, when they feel their rights are being infringed upon, they seek remedy in the courts if they're not successful in the legislative or through markets. The most obvious are Brown versus Board of Education. Most recently, Vergara versus California was a high-stakes case, perhaps less known, obviously, than Brown. But Vergara involved this issue of the teacher tenure laws in California, where students argued that they were not getting a constitutionally adequate education under that state's constitution based on the tenure statutes, which effectively granted tenure after 18 months. All this is by way of saying that frequently we have courts trying to sort out these issues. The two policy issues really that, if we could nutshell it, that deal with value-added models are teacher quality and accountability. These two themes, these two ideas, there's wide agreement in the community of researchers that quality of teachers are important and accountability is important. The agreement breaks down very quickly after that because, well, what is a high quality teacher? What are the accountability metrics that we want to use? So for example, there are many who suggest Teach for America is the model for producing good teachers in our schools, because Teach for America, as you may know, are basically put the best and the brightest from kind of Ivy League schools into classrooms for 3 or 4 weeks as their training. But others would say, well, we're throwing them into schools with no experience. That's not really the model. So there's that debate about quality, and the accountability debate is certainly a debate that's hot as well. Like in most things in policy, those who have the lever of power are the ones that control the agenda and their policies, and for better or for worse, standardized testing has become kind of the coin of the realm in terms of accountability. We saw that with No Child Left Behind, which has sort of faded on. But ultimately, it was just a matter of time before policymakers decided that value-added models would be used as a way to connect a teacher performance directly, to make this kind of direct link, if you will. I put this picture up because we've got it kind of is sort of a tongue-in-cheek at giving a model of a VAM, and sort of I'm a model teacher, kind of playing on that phrase. But I think it expresses some of the frustration that many teachers had suggested was problematic. Most recently, if we think of Race to the Top, that literally was a federal initiative that required states, if they wanted the money, to basically tie in to their teacher evaluation statutes value-added models, and furthermore require them to make them a factor in employment decisions like tenure, bonuses, and things of that nature, which raised a whole bunch of new jurisdictional legal forms where teachers could bring their gripes with VAM and due process, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. I'll highlight 2 cases, tenure and collective bargain agreements. All of this is by way of saying that the policymakers in Washington paid no attention to what the American Statistical Association, which says these should not be used in high-stakes employment decisions. So it wasn't that, and I'm not taking a position that VAMs are bad things, it's just they could be on a simmer, but when you elevate them into high stakes employment decisions, it's a whole different kettle of fish. But of course they ignored that advice, and the shiny object theory kind of went forward. I'll talk about two cases that are in the constitutional law area, and I do that because they're sort of, constitutional law is a little sexier than a collective bargaining agreement or binding arbitration, but that's another area where this litigation has popped up and frustrated school districts. One case is an 11th Circuit opinion out of Florida called Cook versus Stewart. Florida was one of the first receivers of Race to the Top money, $700 million, I believe. And as part of their evaluation criteria by statute, by way of state law, they required that VAMs be used, and they furthermore required that VAMs be used in making employment decisions. This was rather easy for the teachers who were taught tested area subjects. So in grades 4 through 10, students are tested in math and reading. So those were the two standardized tests that could be used for purposes of connecting and making the link of value-added models. But became problematic when you're a 5th grade science teacher, for example. Well, the Florida statute said we don't really care. What we'll do is use one school board said, well, we have to comply with the statute, so what we'll do is we'll just use the reading score for the science teacher's rating. So on the face of it, you can see where that might be unfair. The court, I've got 2 minutes, so I'm gonna move fast. The court said, they went through this whole constitutional idea, and it's littered with warnings saying this is a really stupid idea to do this, but it is constitutional, meaning they couldn't show that it was arbitrary or irrational. That was a substantive due process claim. In the interests of time, I'll just say that the Houston Federation Teachers was an issue where the teachers challenged their access to their VAM ratings, which were held by a third-party vendor who refused to give them out. And as part of due process, you're allowed to sort of hear the evidence against you and critique it. But unfortunately, the third-party vendor, as a proprietary means, held on to their information, would not give it out. And the teachers were victorious on that because they could say, look, I can't show that you made a clerical error, that you've got the correct test scores. This is really all, and Washington, I'll say, in the collective bargaining agreement of the DC public schools, was also successful in terms of overturning some value-added opinions. This is really all by way of saying we have these cases, to some extent, demonstrate the resources and the impact that VAMs have had, and we haven't gained much right now in terms of improving teacher quality. There are some impacts that we should keep in mind, that this litigation comes with costs, and teachers and unions aren't lying down. In fact, one district, and I know my time is up, one district refused to fight it in court, and the court ultimately ruled. They said, we're not spending any more money on this nonsense to defend the decisions having to do with value-added modeling. But what is now happening as a result of some of these challenges is that many districts and federal law are relaxing some of the use of value-added models as it relates to these high-stakes employment decisions, which is something that 10 years ago people were saying, we can use VAMs, but be very careful about using them in value-added decisions, and that's occurring here in Massachusetts. So I know that my time, my time is up. In this compounds, I will say this is my last point. The teacher morale is at an all-time low. We're struggling to get teachers in. It's hard, and if you can think of yourself as whatever context you work in, if you feel that the system of evaluation is unfair, you probably would shy away from that profession. So the use of these models sort of exacerbated that tension in terms of creating an idea of people who might want to go into the profession or want to stay in the profession if they don't feel they're being evaluated fairly.
And question for Mark? Got a couple minutes for question.
I mean, this is kind of a strange question. Has there been an evaluation of VAM itself?
Say that again?
Has there been an evaluation of VAM itself?
What do you mean by evaluation of VAM?
They implemented this thing to evaluate teachers. Have they evaluated if it's really working?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Florida, for example, the ratings, it's not, to answer your question. And Florida is an example where one of the problems was that, 96% of the teachers always get an effective rating. That's why we're going to use VAMs, because we'll string it out and get the bottom 15 out. They've used VAM, obviously, for a number of years. And I think the number's down to like 94% or 95% of teachers still receive an effective rating. So in terms of changing and finding those teachers, that really hasn't had that impact.
So my question is, how have you brought this research into work with the local schools?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I still need to take that step, and I've talked with a number of folks to do that. I have tried here in Massachusetts originally when we were applying for Race to the Top money to sort of raise a cautionary flag. This was prior to any of the litigation. You can only have a crystal ball. So it's a challenge, I think, because the coin of the realm remains trying to quantify certain things. So there is a currency that is associated with this that's hard to get past. A lot of the money that's attached to federal grants, even state grants, comes with requirements such as these. But that's a project to continue, I think, to answer your question. Yeah.
Okay, last question.
Yeah.
Mark, I don't know if this is a question or a comment. I think it's a question.
Yeah.
But based on what I asked before, one of the difficulties, I think, at institutions, especially educational institutions, is ensuring that we're, properly incentivizing certain conduct. And I get the idea that, what makes VAMs maybe interesting is that they're equal. They're equal ways of measuring, right? I mean, the data might be inappropriate to evaluate a person in terms of their teaching effectiveness, but it's equal, right? So it's easy to apply. And I think that's some of the same difficulty that I meant with my comment before, the question before about at higher education institutions. When you try to establish standards that look more towards heuristics than an algorithm, like you mentioned before, right? Where the data is more normative than it is, or more qualitative than quantitative maybe, right? The way you're measuring impact is different than journal article citation rates or the fact that it's peer reviewed. Do you know what I mean? We have an established equation in higher education as well, and it's great to see that some institutions are changing. But do you see how there's a way, I'm trying to make a connection here to, incentivizing more community engagement from academic institutions by moving away from a hard model that is consistent but maybe misapplied when you try to move outside of a silo? Do you have any comments or, suggestions about that based on the work that you've done for schools? Are schools moving away from this? Are they you said that they're not using VAMs as a significant measure, right? They might use it as some measure, but I mean, have you seen any school districts that have said, you know what, this is just a terrible way of doing it and we're going to move in a different direction for various reasons?
Well, some states who did not receive Race to the Top money just were able to ignore this because that's kind of what triggered it. But I also think, to answer your question, that K-12 educators, and schools are engines of democracy, but they also look to higher ed for guidance. And by way of example, if those trends are occurring where higher ed institutions are shifting to a more qualitative focus, for lack of a better term, or and recognizing the limitations that are inherent in some of these ideas, then that itself gives some credence, it gives some cover for school administrators to say, we're not just the quacky school administrators thinking this. Look at the Portland State, this is how they look at things. Different context, but there's a metaphorical, there's applicable lessons to be learned.
Yeah, hi, Mark.
Hi.
And just to kind of both points,
Sure.
I kind of wish I was speaking after you because my research is going to continue this narrative a bit further. Districts are also working on building new ways of quantifying scores, like working with the education community to come up with what you should be scoring the teachers on, so that score actually has more meaning, and that's actually directly linked to the work that I'll be talking about today for a particular sector of the population in the area. So there's like just another angle on looking at those big scale accountability measures.
I think the shame is that it's been 10 years that we've kind of lost a lot of time and resources on sort of the shiny object, when you think about that. So.
Okay.
Good. Thanks.
Mark Page. And let's quickly segue to Meredith Dove, who's an assistant professor of psychology And she's going to be talking to us about her research on obesity prevention for low-income early childcare, in low-income early childcare settings.
Thank you, Matt. So today I want to talk a little bit about a project that I've been working on in the community that I've gotten a lot of support through the Leduc Center and UMass Dartmouth to conduct. And it is an example of bringing the community and involving students in student learning projects to conduct a project on a public health concern, particularly in the South Coast region. As many of you are familiar, in contrast to traditional research, community-based research involves the community in every step of the research, from the beginning of identifying the concern or the research to be addressed, to the design, and then collecting the data. And I will go through all these steps with the project that I'll be talking about. And as we were talking about tenure and promotion standards, I just want to highlight on the right side the community-based participatory research process. Obviously, there's an iterative process by talking with the community partners, going back and forth between each step to be sure that they're on board, continuing to build those relationships, and then, of course, disseminating the results so that it can be useful for the community, and in addition to publications and producing academic products. My background is as a clinical psychologist. I worked in Fall River for many years as a pediatric psychologist at St. Anne's Hospital, working with the underserved population there. I led a lot of different kinds of health groups for families and children, including childhood obesity interventions. And so I sat on the board with others at the Partners for a Healthier Community, which is a nonprofit organization in Fall River. As part of their Mass in Motion initiatives, they were tasked to identify a public health concern and identify which systems to address so that that concern could be reduced. And I'll talk about why we chose childhood obesity as that concern to target, one of which is that obviously with a higher rate of poverty in the South Coast region and lower rates of educational attainment, there's a higher rate of childhood obesity in this area compared to statewide. Here are some of the poverty rates, higher for children in the South Coast region, as well as children and families as a whole. So with this, my involvement with the community and involving the community health leaders who are interested in targeting this issue, I was able, through funding through the university, both at the university level and the Leduc Center, involve some of the students who are also interested in working on this project with me from the counseling program that I am involved in teaching with. And so all of those entities together, we worked on trying to understand what is the problem, or what can we do to help with this issue. As I mentioned, the system that was involved, or the systems initiative through the Mass in Motion program, we identified daycares as a way to start to help identify, are they following the nutrition and physical activity standards set by the American Academy of Pediatrics, particularly in this region. There are standards, there are guidelines. Who knows what's being done in early child care settings, but we do know that 75% of children these days are in these settings for 35 hours a week or more. So they can be instrumental in shaping, modeling the nutrition habits and physical activity. They can promote physical activity, and they interface with parents, so they can be an educator of sorts for those types of early childhood obesity prevention practices. So with Partners for a Healthier Community involved and the students that I was working with, we set up specific aims and made we tasked ourselves with trying to understand what was going on in early childcare settings in terms of nutrition and physical activity practices, and comparing those with the statewide early childcare settings. And I'll talk about how we were able to do that. We were also interested in hearing from early childcare providers in terms of understanding what they need, what are the barriers or needs to implement these early childcare obesity prevention guidelines. As you can imagine, we expected that in the South Coast region, the rates of adherence to those guidelines would be lower than statewide. So we designed a mixed methods study. We had early childcare providers complete a measure of self-report of their nutrition and early childcare physical activity practices. And we were able to, through a data sharing agreement with the CDC, compare those to the statewide adherence rates. So we did have some interesting findings. We can see that at the top there are some areas that were lower in adherence than we would expect. So 3.3% of childcare settings in the South Coast region followed the guideline to offer milk that is fat-free to children over the age of 2. Only 25% were able to offer vegetables 2 times a day or more. Those are the guidelines. So the top 3 are areas that they were struggling in. The bottom couple are the guidelines that they're following at the highest level that we were able to find within these guidelines. And in comparison with statewide, we didn't actually see, surprisingly, that there were differences overall with statewide adherence and South Coast region adherence. But we did see, as you can see at the very bottom, the last 2 guidelines of low fat or fat-free milk was not they were not as adherent to that, or fruit juice. So they were serving more fruit juice than statewide early child care centers. So some interesting findings. Overall, the differences were not significant with adherence to all of the practices, but we were also interested, as I mentioned, in understanding from early child care providers what they felt like their needs were, what their barriers were to implementing these practices. And so we ran focus groups at the Fall River YMCA, where I was able to bring some of the research assistants from the university to help run those groups. And from my perspective, that's a great counseling type of experience. And they were also facilitated by the community leaders. So Partners for Healthier Community staff were also involved in leading those focus groups alongside with my students and myself. This is just a photo from the Partners for Healthier Community website, and just a clip that they wanted to, I don't know if this will work, but this is us doing those focus groups in the community. Partners for Healthier Community was really excited about having us partner with them. They put this on their website. They all signed releases for it.
Says you, I don't like that. It's like that's not okay to use that word because other people.
I don't want to spend too much time on it, but you get the sense that they embraced this partnership with the university, and that was great to see. Through the analyses of the qualitative data, I have one of my colleagues from Brown University who's training my students on how to code the qualitative data, and we're in the process of finishing that up and disseminating the results. And even that has been, we've had such a welcoming in terms of different committees we've been invited to within the community, and to disseminate the results and talk about any further projects. So there, this project was sort of a preliminary investigatory or exploratory study, and we're hoping to build on the partnerships that we've made. And I think there's an art and a science to that, just kind of maintaining those partnerships and getting community involvement and really maintaining those relationships so that we can continue forward with bigger projects or other projects or things that they're interested in looking at, as well as the early child care settings. So thank you for your support. Thanks.
Questions for Meredith? I have a question. So have you thought in terms of working with those partners to develop an intervention such that we could overcome those 3 areas in which there were deficiencies for this population?
So there's been talk about bringing these results back to the Department of Early Education and Child Care and trying to devote more trainings to staff about those areas in particular, as well as some of the other areas that the staff has discussed. A lot of them had talked about wanting more staff training in terms of how to get the children involved in preparing healthy foods, getting more creative ways to do physical activity indoors and outdoors. So, yes. we will be talking with the HEAL committee, which is one of the committees in the Fall River area, to kind of understand what they think would be most effective in terms of how to address those areas.
So you and I had a brief conversation before this event, and I know I kind of rushed you, right? But my question to you is something that we discussed very briefly, which was, do you have any sense of the impact on your students since they were very much involved in this research process?
Absolutely. So a lot of them are still working with me. We started this project in 2016, and they're still working with me to develop other interventions. We're working with the Fall River Boys and Girls Club, and they're really, we collected some of this data that was more exploratory, and they're really interested in designing interventions that we can sort of look at ways to access the lower income populations that might not be able to make it to the sessions in person. So anyway, that will be, but yeah, I mean, there's so much, I think, interest from the students in terms of how to actually make a difference with a public health concern like this, and they want to get out and start doing some of that work.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Okay, let's give Meredith a hand.
Thank you.
While we're segueing, I could also give a shot at Chad's question, which is basically different departments approach this differently. And some are much more open to accepting different artifacts and understanding impact beyond just referee journal publication. And some are not. And before Ronny comes up here, I have to shamelessly give a 1-minute commercial for another event that the Ledoux Center is sponsoring soon here on campus as part of the Chancellor's Inauguration Week, and we invite you all to join us. So the Moth is sponsored by NPR, and it's quote-unquote ordinary people who tell absolutely extraordinary and motivational and inspirational stories. So April 17th at 7 p.m. in our auditorium. It's invitation only. The tickets are going very well, but I have some tickets with me, and I'd love to give them to you, where you can invite family and friends to join you. April 17th, the Moth, I promise you. The theme is Giving is Living, and the 3 speakers are going to speak about how community service changed their lives and the lives of people around them. I promise it will be inspirational. So see me at the end of this. If you would like tickets to the Moth, we'd love to have you. Okay, now Ronny Sherwin, and he's going to have to introduce his community partner because I don't remember her name.
Thanks. So 3 or 4 years ago, shortly after I arrived on campus as the new chair from the music department, having come from a program where I was involved already in civic engagement, I recognized that the students in the music department, especially the music ed students, had 2 major needs. The first need was that they needed to be engaged with actual students beyond just the formal pre-practicum and practicum opportunities. They needed to be, from the beginning, out engaged with people. I also recognize that personally, having come from an area of civic engagement and being stuck in an office as a chair, that I needed an opportunity to be involved with the public and students, and that I wanted my students to come to feel the same way as I did. And I was sharing this with a community member, and we might have been at a bar. And he said, I know somebody, and he literally handed me a telephone that was ringing and said, when she answers, talk to her. And it was Terry Walkowitz, my now research partner from the New Bedford Symphony. And through this partnership, on the phone, having never met, she agreed that we would start to work together. And through the process, I found myself engaged not only in an opportunity for my students to get involved with this symphony and education, but also to be involved in a way of looking at music education that crossed silos. And not just crossed the silos, in many ways, as you'll see, it demolished some of the silos that music students traditionally develop. That is that we are in the arts, we are not in math, we are not in science, and that's just not true. So now my students, some of my students, and I fairly heavily are involved with Terry in this project. And what we're doing, I think, is really changing the way some of our students think about civic engagement and the way we think about what it means to be a music educator. In terms of some of the data you're going to see, it's early on. We fortunately just got a new grant so that we are going to be able to focus on assessment, and ed assessment in the arts is actually my area, so I'm super excited. But the fact is, I get really excited about civic engagement, and we only have 10 minutes. So I'm going to turn this over to Terry, who's going to talk about what we literally did and hopefully keep me from running my mouth.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, I'm just going to click this. There we go. All right, I wanted to start with this definition of arts integration. It's a beautiful definition. It just doesn't happen. So as you read that, I'll just tell you what the reality is. Usually you're in a school and some classroom teacher comes running down the hallway saying, oh, we're doing a unit on the dinosaurs. Can you guys sing a song about the dinosaurs? Or the visual arts teacher is asked, say, oh, we're exploring the water cycle. Can you have your students make a poster about the water cycle? And the problem with these types of arts integration is it's very lopsided, right? The arts are being used to serve the learning and academic subjects without any true authentic outcomes of their own. I mean, I'm pretty sure that the water cycle poster is not being assessed for artistic elements, but probably more for scientific content, right? So a little different is concept-based arts integration. That's what we've been working with, and it's a little different than the generic forms of arts integration out there. Concept-based arts integration is built around the idea of a shared fundamental concept. This means that the concept is rich, relevant, and authentic in all connecting subject areas equally. And each subject area is presented with integrity, where they're all achieving their own learning outcomes equally. So some of the benefits of concept-based arts integration is that obviously all subject areas are mutually benefited. It kind of creates a two-way street where the learning in one subject area strengthens the learning in the other and vice versa. It allows multiple entry points for students to build understanding. I mean, because we all have our own disciplines and we communicate and represent information very differently from each other, right? So in science, we could represent information with a graph or an experiment or with a written word. In music, we could have it through a musical performance, composition, even music listening. So by nature of our differences, we are able to allow multiple entry points for kids to develop their understanding of the shared concept. And the good news is that by exploring a concept across subject areas, including the arts, students are able to build a deeper, more flexible understanding than would have been possible by one subject alone. And by flexible, I'm talking about transfer of learning. So transfer of learning is basically just taking something you learn in school and using it again in the future. I mean, that really is the goal of school, right? Learn something in school and use it later. Unfortunately, transfer does not take care of itself. We need to structure learning opportunities to support transfer of learning. There are many ways that transfer, we can see evidence of failure to transfer. Can I show the little? All right. So David Perkins, researcher at Harvard, tells a story about a teacher teaches kids how to calculate the time it takes a ball to fall from the top of a tower. And then on the test, he asked them to calculate the time it takes a ball to fall in a well. And the students complained that they had not covered that in class. So the attention to the surface context is tower and well, right? But the surface context completely derails them, that they fail to see that this is the same problem, okay? By doing concept-based arts integration, our individual domains have our own surface context, right? But we continually use that surface context to support the idea of the connected concept. So all of our domain-specific information is constantly being pulled up to the conceptual level, and it allows students to build a schema that transcends individual contexts and supports transfer of learning. So as we see that transfer of learning will extend their scope beyond surface details, things that will derail them on a test, and really builds a deep understanding that they can then see how and when it's appropriate to use that information, that understanding, in new and novel contexts. So I've been doing this with the symphony for about 8 years now, but the past 4 years I'm stuck with science. I didn't think I could connect to science, but once I started, I realized that music and science share a lot of shared concepts, and so I've kind of hung out there. And I think it's also good for science because students see that science really extends its boundaries as well. So I'm just going to go to an example of what we did last year. Our shared concept was gravity. Gravity in space and gravity in music. We have gravity in music, okay? If I end an Adele song on the second to last chord, you're all gonna say it's not done, right? You know something is not right. Well, the pull of certain chords pull to other chords. Some have a strong pull, some have a weaker pull. We use that to our advantage to help let children hear the different orbital rates and gravitational pull of planets in our solar system. So this is a chart that shows the varying degrees of gravitational pull. We use Roman numerals in music to indicate different chords. And then we explored gravity in space, understanding how massive planets and stars curve space-time, and that curvature of space-time creates gravity. The closer you get to the sun's curving space-time, the more gravitational pull, and the faster the planet will orbit. So we put the two together. Oh, there we go. So we played a piece by Mozart that had just a quick cycle of 3 chords, all very strong gravitational pull in these chords to imitate the quick gravitational pull of Mercury in that quick 88-day orbit. By the time we get out to Neptune, we played a piece by Shostakovich, which is really a very long chord cycle to imitate Neptune's long orbit on chords that have a much less gravitational pull. In the classroom, we worked with the students. We brought in a gravity well so that they could experiment with gravity in the solar system. And then we allowed them to compose their own chord cycles, coding their chords into a program called Scratch, developed by MIT. And then we hooked the computer up to a makey-makey. Do you know what a makey-makey? No? Okay. Anyway, it's this thing that you hook to a computer, and we made Play-Doh planets. And if you put the alligator clips in each Play-Doh planet, they just have to touch the planet to be able to hear the chord orbit, okay? We're all on the same page. And I didn't electrocute one student, so that was fantastic news. We did some assessment the year that we did symmetry. We did pre and post testing. You can see that there's some amazing results there. But the quick thing I want to tell you is that while that's really impressive, the thing that struck me the most was a school that they pay a lot of money to go there, and they took the symmetry test, and the part that looked like their workbook page, the pre-test, they aced it. But they failed the rest of the test. They couldn't perceive symmetry, identify it visually, auditorily. They couldn't even put pepperoni pieces on a pizza in a way that was symmetrical. And what scared me was that the teacher would have given them the workbook test, and what would she have told herself? My kids know symmetry, right? They didn't know it at all. So I'm going to let you, do you want to, I've talked the whole time.
So in addition to just looking at the pre and post tests, for the purposes of community engagement and having the symphony out in the schools and students out in the schools, some of these statements like you can read, learning in concert teaches tough concepts in brilliant ways that make sense using the power of music to do it. All of these statements coming from teachers and students are probably, at least for those of us who are in teaching for the students, are as equally important as some of the numbers, despite being a number geek. I think one of the things that is great about this is it really does allow for great partnerships between area colleges and universities. I can work with Terry and the Symphony on the assessment end of it. She can bring my students in. This program reaches 55 schools in the region. So this is an opportunity. So my students have 55 schools. I had said at the onset, I need a place to put kids. Now it's, I don't have enough kids to be able to do what I could do with her. And it's serving my program, it's serving her program, and more importantly, it's serving the community.
Thank you.
This is certainly a great example of where the community partner is co-creator of knowledge and also co-educator. I could see where your students benefit tremendously by being involved with her. No question about it. Questions?
It sounds fantastic. Have there been any challenges to the working together that you'd like to share?
I mean, for me, the biggest challenge is the challenge that we always face as college professors. It's getting my kids to find a ride to the schools to do this. And also, I think, letting them recognize that this is really important. One of the problems with music is we yell at them constantly, get in that little practice room, and then they come to my class and I say, get out of the practice room and go into the community. So that is one of the challenges, is just getting them involved. One of the things I've started doing is bringing Terry into the classroom so they meet her first thing and hopefully get energized the way I did. But that's the biggest problem, I think, is getting them out of the practice room and into it. And, quite frankly, I use the grade book as leverage as much as anything, even though I wish they were motivated to do it.
And if you reach out to Ron through our symphony, we've done, each year it's a different concept. This year was balance and ecology. And in music orchestration, we've done adaptations in motion, exploring evolutionary biology and motion in music. We have short videos, YouTube videos, where you really get a sense of what this looks like with the kids. So feel free to hit him up, and he'll give you the links to the YouTube videos. Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, let's give him a hand. And a quick segue, and I know we're just about on time. Professor Cristina Cipriano, Assistant Professor of Psychology, and she's going to talk about conducting engaged research with traditionally underserved populations. So, Cristina.
Gotcha. You have a little. All right, great. Thanks so much, Matt. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about conducting community engaged research with traditionally underserved student populations. So I'm Chris Cipriano, Applied Developmental and Educational Psychology Assistant Professor in the Psych Department. I'm really interested and honored to be here today learning with all of you. I am the Principal Investigator of a project known as RELATE. It stands for Recognizing Excellence in Learning and Teaching. We are a multi-university research to practice partnership that focuses on understanding social processes in traditionally underserved student populations. We work in schools, classrooms, and educational contexts that don't often get a lot of attention. We've developed a classroom observation tool, an approach to professional development, longitudinal analyses of looking at what's happening in these classrooms and effectiveness over time, as well as putting a culturally responsive lens on something that's very important to me, which is social and emotional learning. So I'm going to give you just a little bit about the project as we go through and show you some evidence from it, and then I'm also really excited to hopefully get a couple of minutes to talk with you. So in our era of educational accountability, as my colleague previously was speaking about, not all of our learners are actually treated equally. And I was wondering, despite the overwhelming consensus that social emotional learning and other foundations for education are critical for our students, there is a lack of evidence-based programming for our most vulnerable learners. So our evidence-based programming is least accessible to the students and the teachers who need it the most. Now, you may have heard the expression, to educate the whole child, you need to start with SEL, with social emotional learning. I'm going to change that a little bit, actually to educate all children, all people, all learners. If we think about all of ourselves as learners in our fields, we need to start by thinking about social and emotional learning. So for those of you who are outside of the education and psychology fields and are like, what is these acronyms? SEL is an interrelated set of cognitive, affective, and behavioral competencies. They underscore your capacity to learn, to develop, and maintain mutually respectful and supportive, healthy relationships, physically and psychologically. I like to think about it if you think about academic learning like a painting. SEL would be that brush that paints the picture of what quality instruction and learning actually looks like in that setting. It creates the foundation for your future ability to be a learner and a contributor to your society. So who are traditionally underserved student populations? Well, I'm talking about your diverse learners, your students with special education needs who fall below the threshold for mainstream inclusion in our general education classrooms. They may reside in residential or treatment or therapeutic facilities, in correctional facilities. They're the students who attend school, extended school year, all year round. They're in therapeutic and medical settings, untraditional, transitional, and alternative school placements. So all of the other kids and all of the teachers who are working with them. So why students educated in these settings and the teachers who serve them are actually excluded from those large-scale RCTs, from those randomized controlled trials and longitudinal designs. They're excluded from the funding to look at what's happening in their settings due to factors and variabilities related to the setting that they're in, the constituents of the students, and the factors that are facing the teachers that serve them. Well, you know, you can't have evidence-based practice without any evidence, right? There's a fundamental problem here. So that's where my postdoc started. And our research found that although there was an abundance of classroom observation scales and getting to the earlier conversation of accountability and the value-added models, right, none of them actually adequately captured the range of social interactions and processes that were occurring in these settings. And so we published a paper on it to kind of get us started and get funders interested that, like, wow, there's a whole area of research here that's to be developed. So you know what, like, we should do something. Right? Actually, no, we can and will do more, better, everything, because just because children and their teachers fall below the, they're behind the starting line, doesn't mean they're to be excluded from the conversation. Actually, wouldn't you think that they are most likely to benefit from our attention and our resources investing in them, right? They have the largest opportunity for gain. So Matt said to me, make sure you pull some data and some science in, so I'm going to give you a framework here from Henrik and colleagues on assessing a research to practice partnership. So what do you need to do to create productive community partners, and what do funders look for? And this is a framework that comes from folks who published through the William T. Grant Foundation, who are actually one of our major funders of the Relate Project and have been kind of championing us over our 6 years in developing this work. So the 5 dimensions of effectiveness, well, you need to build trust in cultivating that partnership. I'm not going to spend time on all the details, but you want to make sure that you are investing in them and spending the time there. To one of the colleagues in the audience before who kept asking about, well, it takes a lot of time to do this work, and how does that affect things? All I kept thinking about when hearing those comments was, I get asked a lot in my department from senior folks as an assistant professor, gosh, you're never here. You're like never here. Yeah, and you know, it's funny because I think, actually, I'm always out there, and as one of my research colleagues, my community partner colleagues said to me years ago, he said, you know, from the moment I met you, Chris, I knew you weren't just doing a research drive-by. I knew you were actually going to spend time and get to know us and invest in us so that we could do really good work together. So it takes time, and it takes a lot of face time to let them trust you and let you in so that you can learn with them as to what it is we were, in this case, even going to begin studying, to even build our tool to understand what was happening. Then you need to conduct rigorous research to inform action. You need to actually start to do the research that's going to get published both in the scholarly journals, but also be applicable to the community that you're working with. And in this case, we developed this tool, our framework, and this is just one of our artifacts on it. We developed the teacher power interactions framework because we realized in going out and working systematically in these different educational settings that there was no way to understand the interactions between all of the different educators in the room. So you couldn't actually improve the processes in the classroom because you couldn't even evaluate them because you didn't know who the teacher was. There was so much going on. So how do we identify it? What are our models for understanding it? And similarly, we developed something known as a classroom observation research extension to actually profile the classroom so that anybody could look at the classroom and say, okay, this is the makeup of the kids, the students, these are the different dimensions that we need to look for to affect change. As one teacher said to me early in my work, you know, she was talking about some of the other accountability structures that were used in that and that are looked at for value-added modeling. My students would never be proficient with the framework for teaching, for instance, which is most states have adopted it. For our kids, the goal is to ask the question, not actually to answer it. So that's actually like when you look at those proportions of teachers who are doing well, they never can be considered to be the teachers who should be getting the pay raise and being kept on because their kids are never going to reach those benchmarks. Like what you're seeing in their classrooms isn't what the tool is accounting for. Third dimension, supporting the partners to achieve what their goals are. So one of my community partners in Long Island, in New York, they, over the course of us building this tool and this work together, they also said to me, you know, Chris, I know this isn't your area, but like, could you help us? We want to work on doing, building a high school to college partnership. Like, how do we work with a college to try to help our kids go from special ed to higher ed? And we started piloting that and doing that work together. And this is a picture of us years and years ago on the bottom, and then a picture of us just last month in DC presenting some of that pilot work. So helping them to get to where their goal was, which is move beyond some of the scope of my initial work. We also need to make sure we're producing knowledge that can inform educational improvement efforts more broadly. So our work is being published in and talked about in kind of public circles like Education Week and op-eds where we're commenting on what we're seeing going on right now and how our science kind of supports our understanding of it, as well as thinking more broadly about educational contexts and ways that we can improve them. And then lastly, building capacity for partnerships. And this goes back to my earlier comment with my senior colleagues asking me where I am all the time, because I'm always out talking to somebody and we're always out figuring out ways to connect like-minded people who are all interested and invested in helping kids and their teachers do the best they can in meaningful ways. And Matt's been awesome with that because he's actually connected me with a number of those folks over my time as a service learning fellow that has proliferated into a number of other projects. So it's not magic, it's science. How do you build evidence-based educational programming for all of our learners? You work with them, not at them, not for them, and you make sure your work is community-based, not community-placed. And so I think I'm at time, so thank you.
She could have done that little PowerPoint flip really easily, huh? Questions for Christina? You guys didn't run out of gas, did you?
That's okay.
Yes, Dwight.
I really like the point you make about community-based versus community-placed, and I hope at some point you can expand on that as part of your scholarship, because it's a much-needed point. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Oh, well, okay, I'll give you a really great example. So during my postdoc, we were like, all right, we need to understand what needs to be evaluated. And so we do all this research and we think we know what we're talking about, and we go in and we talk to teachers, and I have all my little index cards, like old school. I'm gonna have them Q sort it to tell me about what the category should be. And the teachers looked at the cards and they're like, well, what do you mean by this? And I start giving them like a research definition. For the particular card that made me laugh was differentiated instruction. And she looked at me and she's like, well, obviously, like the kids wouldn't be here if it wasn't differentiated instruction. Like, why would you consider that a metric? And we're just sitting there, we're videoing audio, we're like, oh yeah, right, like that would make complete sense. But as researchers, right, sometimes we often will come in thinking we know, but you don't actually know anything until you're there spending time with it.
Yes, Nick.
Thanks for a great presentation. You mentioned really quickly this, that when folks came to you and said, could you help with the pathways from high school to college? That, you know, we know this isn't your area of expertise. Like, how do you, as a scholar, think about that tension of responding to what your community partners are asking for versus this, you know, expertise that you've built up? Like, how did you navigate that?
It's a really, really good question. So I'm up here alone, and I shouldn't be, because Relate is a team, and there's a group of us working on this. And so what my collaborators and I do when we get kind of approached with these types of questions is we decide who's going to spend any of their like extra time, not that we have it, on that other project, because we want to make sure that we're nurturing that relationship. And also, we have something to learn from it. So in that case, that was a problem, like a question that was brought to us that it's not my area, but I'm interested in learning about it, and let's all learn about it together. Whereas my partner, she took on another project that another school had talked to us about that was more of interest to her learning as she wanted to continue to grow. So we kind of like divide up that responsibility so that we're all still meeting the needs of our partners. And I've learned so much through it. Like, it's been incredible watching kids. They're actually taking their their high school senior year courses on a community college campus, and they're like assessing the outcomes of that, and then they're helping with their transition. Like, it's remarkable. Not something that I studied, but something I'm learning a tremendous amount about through the process. Yeah.
Let's give Christina a hand. And last but certainly not least is Nic Angela, who is an assistant professor of public policy. And his research is actually done primarily by one of his graduate students, but the graduate student could not make it today. Nic guided that research. It's a little bit unfortunate that we couldn't have the student here. It was great that we had the community partner here for one presentation, especially given Nic's comments initially about the co-creation of knowledge and the importance of students and community partners in that process. So Nic is going to talk about linking AP courses in high school with the seniors' attendance in college later on. The data is pretty clear.
So I'm going to be real brief, and I think I'm going to use Christina as to follow up with an example of the very important issue that she raised and that Mark was talking about in the beginning about teacher effectiveness evaluation. So Kristen is not just a graduate student. She has 20-some plus years in ed administration, and she's the senior systems analyst for Worcester County Schools. So students in our program have to choose a capstone project that will help them solve a problem at work. So she says to me, and I will guide you through the argument of her research, why are you looking at AP courses? We know they're important. We're trying to capture out exactly which ones and at what level are so important. So I'm pointing her to the literature to see what the Academy has found empirically so far, and there's some data up there that I don't want to bore you with, but it's there, trust me. There's literature on the subject. So I said, so what are you guys compiling? Send me the spreadsheets. I'm the statistician. So let me teach you some statistics here. So she's like, I said, so show me how you're coding things and tell me what it is that you want to find out. She's like, well, we have this college indicator defined as the plans for students when they exit high school of what they want to do for college. And this is how we have it coded. They're not planning on going to college, we give them a 0. If they're planning to go to a community college that's public, we give them a 1, 2-year private. I'm like, there's such a thing as a 2-year private? She's like, yeah. I say, okay, don't answer. They get a 2. 3, they get if they're planning for a public 4-year school, and 4 if they're aiming for a, the Harvards of the world. So, and I said, and what else are you compiling for the students, right? Oh, she's like, oh, the usual demographics. I said, show me, what are they? So ethnicity, race, we pay attention if they're a non-English speaker versus English language learner. I can explain later what that is. If they're economically disadvantaged. And then we have the explanatory variables that we're keeping out or we're trying to code is, well, one is very simple, how many AP courses they take, which is what she was really interested in. And I was like, okay, you just tell me why you're so interested in this later on. But she says, there's also this other thing that we're kind of linking to AP access, which is this access indicator that is coded as lenient to strict, and I can bore you about that later if you really want to talk about it, but for the sake of time, just said, the difference between those two, I'm really interested in. I said, okay, let's crunch the numbers. What can you give me? So she gives me, with approval, all of the Worcester County High School data that she can get, and I said, well, let's do some regressions, and she's like, okay, good, because I don't know how to do that. I'm like, you've been in ed data analysis for decades? You haven't run a simple regression? She's like, no. And she's not the only one. That's probably 90% of our ed administrators. She's absolutely right. So I said, okay, I will teach you statistics and we crunch the numbers. So as we're going over the numbers and we're doing the explanatory variables and the control variables, she just lights up and she gets so excited because the number of AP courses, not the AP access indicator, keeps on coming significant. And what I'm showing up here is we have graduating cohorts, because that's how we analyze it. She gave me 7 years worth of data, so I'm just presenting the last 3. So she gets really excited about the AP courses. She was kind of expecting the demographics to be important. She was kind of expecting the economic conditions to be important, but not in this way. So when we were done with this, she was very hopeful that the economically disadvantaged indicator was showing statistical significance in some years. And the way that it's coded here, actually a higher number, because you'll see a positive relationship, means more economically disadvantaged. 2 is below the poverty line. 1 is in need. 0 doesn't qualify for assistance. So she was like, okay, this is an example that, you know, we're doing something right here, that we're actually paying attention to the economically disadvantaged kids, because technically if we put them on an ordinal scale with what their plans for college are, they're aiming higher. They're aiming to go to at least a 3, maybe a 2. So the next step is we're going to run a multinomial analysis. We won't do an ordinal scale. Again, I don't want to bore you with statistics, so we'll talk about it later. So anyway, but I said, so why are you so excited? Because she says to me, because now I can go into a meeting and fight for that teacher that can teach 9th grade AP geography. Then when it dawned on me, oh my God, she's absolutely right. Because schools will not invest in that teacher. They'll invest in the AP English, AP Math, junior and senior year. And that's how that AP Access Indicator coding scale is coded. Because schools will decide what AP courses to invest in, what teachers to invest in. And you know, if you're dealing with high schools, that they're having a hard time retaining the teachers who can teach AP courses, rewarding the teachers who can teach the AP courses. So having some evidence that there's such a thing as a transfer theory, that 9th grade AP geography teacher could have inspired somebody who wants to be an archaeologist, who never knew that they might be attuned to archaeology, is extremely important. So I'll end on the fact that this is what the Engaged Scholarship component of our program looks like, working with the working professionals, helping them solve problems at work, teaching them data and method skills that allow them to do better data analysis. This is what makes my job so fun, because I get to learn things about AP Access Indicator coding that I didn't even know existed before she came into my class. But it is also important because now we've submitted this to a major conference, and the next is she is committed to get this out in print, because she's reading the academic literature and she knows what the debate is. And she knows that there's case study assessments, there's school-level qualitative research, but there is no actual causal analytic secondary data coding analysis out there that she can focus on and said, this has been studied in exiting classes, this is the way that we can code it, and she can help other administrators actually develop better data measuring metrics, because by law, they're now required to keep that data. Large data sets, and they don't know what to do with it. That's it.
And for Nic.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering whether you've done similar research, or she's done similar research on dual enrollment. So I'm at Bristol Community College, and one of the trends that we've seen over time is that more and more high school students are engaging in dual enrollment because they carry that credit over, and they can more quickly complete an associate degree or a bachelor's degree under that model. But we have a lot of literature related to dual enrollment. And as dual enrollment grows, many school systems have kind of done away with the
With
AP.
yep.
But my hypothesis is that it doesn't matter necessarily whether it's AP or dual enrollment. You would come up with a very similar conclusion. The more classes that you take, the more confidence you're building, the more
Right.
you're really moving into that notion of, you know, I'm going to be going to college after graduation. So that would be, if you haven't thought about it, that would be a great comparison, because there's just so much similarity between the two entities, and dual enrollment is becoming so much more accessible than ever before. And even at our community college, for example, we provide free tuition to those
Yep.
students who are dually
Who are dually
enrolled at the lower socioeconomic level. So that's another
Yeah.
piece to look at as moving forward, that I think that's so critical for teachers and administrators at the K-12.
And actually, I wanted to bring this up, but I was rushing for time, is because the way that we're looking at college readiness, preparedness, and plans, right? So you get excited because you think you're really smart, and you can do really well in AP courses, and you can qualify for financial aid, so you're aiming high. But I'm a proud product of community colleges. I will say to the smartest kids, go to a community college, get an associate's degree, transfer it out. That's what I did, and here I am. So I want to code this now not as a ranked ordinal scale, but as a multinomial scale where I want you to identify the choice. Because then the community college weighing of the benefits of going to a community college because of a dual enrollment incentive will be much clearer. But yeah, so we're going to move in that direction. I'm working now with also another project. He's not on full inclusion. I've moved into the education policy arena in the last year, so I'm still learning. So thank you.
Another question for Nic. Nic, I'm also one of those guys that went to community college before I went on, and I actually went to Bristol Community College. And it was a game changer. That's the second time I used the word game changer, right? I started that with talking about Chancellor Johnson. We are out of time, but we're not out of a few things. The first thing is gratitude to our keynote speaker and all our presenters.